All right, welcome everybody to the Institute on Religion and Democracy. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute. We're delighted that you're here. We're delighted by those who are watching online and who will watch this video when posted later on, hopefully by tomorrow. We are hosting this event with our friends at the Philos Project. Our speaker is my old friend Jonathan Silver from the Tikva Fund, discussing anti-Semitism, which, as all of us know, is a malevolent political, cultural, and spiritual force that we are compelled to confront and to rebut. So we appreciate Jonathan's wisdom. But first, we're going to hear from Isaac Woodward from the Philos Project. Isaac, are you there?
All right. Thank you all for joining us here in person and also remotely. I'll briefly mention the work that the Philos Project does. So we were formed about 10 years ago in order to try to equip Christians across the globe, most of our population being in the US, about how to understand the Near East region as a whole, how to understand how our Christian faith ties to the Semitic peoples and the region, how the fact that God spoke into history at a certain time to Abraham, and that the descendants that he had and the descendant religions continue to have such a massive impact across the globe, how all these things should inform both how our personal faith operates and also how we approach state policy, foreign policy, and relations across interfaith dialogues as well. So in order to have people understand these issues more deeply, we take people on trips across the region to Israel. We've gone to Jordan, the UAE, other places. I see people in the audience here who have joined us on many of these trips. And it's quite a blessing to be able to go and undertake these experiences and particularly go to the Holy Land again and get reacquainted myself with these topics with such bright, promising young professionals like those of you here. Also, if you're watching remotely or want to spread the word, you can engage in a lot of the content and information that we put out through our online Pathfinder courses. You can see that by going to philosproject.org, and you'll see a banner for Pathfinder. And it's basically a series of master classes you can go through, about 2 to 5 hours in content each, to go deeper onto a certain subject. So there's one about anti-Semitism specifically, if you want to go deeper into this topic. There are country-specific studies into Syria and Lebanon, American foreign policy in the region, introduction to Islam, and how Christians should approach that faith, along with many other topics. So I encourage you all to check that out later and go deeper on your own. We also have other in-person events and retreats that are hosted for people that complete those courses, which we'll mention later on. So today, we stand here on the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and I think it's important to take note of that. Some of our fathers, maybe, grandfathers and great-grandfathers at this point would have been engaged in that conflict, either on the shores of Normandy itself or later in the subsequent conflicts. My own grandfather followed the Allied advance through to Berlin and ended up having many life experiences and coming home with a German Jewish war bride, which is why I'm here today. So this day always stands out to my family. Particular mark, it's the most important thing about the day. But I'm sure many of you have seen the coverage and the amazing feats undertaken by, I saw today, a 97-year-old veteran who did the skydiving once again, harnessed to a modern special operator, and just these amazing spirits of resilience that still inspire us today. And this day, that conflict and World War II in general wasn't only about anti-Semitism, but it was the single most evil, systematic effort we've ever seen by a given regime to implement, the final solution of anti-Semitism, where it all ends, essentially. We've seen tyrants and empires and regimes across history all try their own variety of anti-Semitism, whether through daily practices of degradation like dhimmitude across the Muslim world, or many of the discriminatory practices and pogroms that would shake Christendom across the ages. But whatever the type of anti-Semitism implemented, the presence of it and the extent to which it's acted upon was always a symptom of the health of the society. It was always something that could be looked at to see where civilization was fraying, where decency was fraying, and in particular, those of us with a Christian legacy, where many of our forebears showed the widest contradiction and the most tragic betrayal of the values that we claim as Christians. And as the Philos Project, and those of you gathered in the room here, we're here to correct that legacy and to connect these ancient truths that come from the Torah, that come from the Bible, and all of these things that we all share this mission with, and connect that thread to show the unbroken link of our shared legacy. But we can't only focus on the positives, we have to also wrestle with this stark truth. So I think we should all thank God that enough brave people stood up in countless ways across many different theaters of the war 80 years ago today, starting with the retaking of the continent of Europe, and that we get to share in that legacy. But I think we also shouldn't be complacent that just because outside of Israel itself now, the threat we face against anti-Semitism is less existential. It's less about bombs and tanks. It's about activism. It's about cultural rot. It's about countless subtle ways in which the Jewish identity of people becomes a burden to bear. And the thing that should be most celebrated and most honored, whether you believe in the faith or not, it's something so tragic to think that the deepest beliefs you hold, the blood that you share from your relatives in the past that you admire and look up to their legacy, that should be the very thing that you have to hide the most, I think should break all of our hearts. And so even though we battle in a different way against anti-Semitism, I think we should be just as inspired to follow in that legacy, in those footsteps. So a little bit thematically on anti-Semitism itself, before I'll turn it over to Jonathan Silver for his remarks. It's very interesting to me because it's a shape-shifting evil. So in some ages, they posit a new reason to hate Jews. In other ages, they will just recycle something from the past, often in the cases of religions. So sometimes we'll hear that Jews are too powerful and controlling, or on the other hand, some ages they're too weak and pathetic to be really respected, or they're too rich and powerful, or they're too poor and a burden on society. Or in some ages and in some places, they're stateless and unmoored to the culture and the civilization they're living in. They're kind of parasites. Maybe they're disloyal or should be suspected. And in other ages, particularly since the refounding of the State of Israel in 1948, they're seen as too rooted in that place. Why do they have to care about that land so much? Those regions, can't they just go somewhere else? Can't they just get along? In that case, they're too patriotic. They're too tied to the land. They're too invested in these fundamental things that often we talk about being respected as patriotism. Or sometimes they're seen as too religious and superstitious, and it's something from the past that should be phased out, basically. Or in other times, they're too enlightened and too secular and too progressive, and they're lacking respect for whatever the cultural civilization that's critiquing them at the time thinks is more valuable. Or they're too liberal and modern and eager to use government forces and collective will to meddle in society, arts, and culture. Or, on the other hand, they might be seen as too conservative and too insular and not focused enough on the outside society and integration. So, as you can see, the reasons are ever shifting. Each age will have its own particular fixation and thing that it wants to single out as the right reason. And I often think about this in a similar way to communism or other evil ideas. You get a sense like modern anti-Semites think it just hasn't been done right. Like old ideas or regimes hated Jews for the wrong reasons, but now we have the right reasons too. They're not, woke enough, they're not colored enough or white enough or whatever it is. Everyone wants to rewrite their own reason to particularly think that this is the unique time, that it's okay to single people out in this way. With the modern campus radicals and leftists there, the fixation has become about anti-Zionism, that's kind of the focus that is okay to single out, and therefore this somehow also gives them justification for targeting individually Jewish-looking people or people they assume to be. As you can see, the logic can't really be pinned down because it's never really about logic or reason. And we do have to refute those things. We have to get engaged in the arguments. But it is a spiritual battle, and it's an ideological battle that we have to stay ever vigilant against. But I think we've increasingly seen that the majority of public will, particularly in the US and also in some other places across Western society with vestiges of the Christian heritage, is against anti-Semitism. But now we're reaching a period where I think the three main divisions across the ideological spectrum are contracting and expanding. So you've had anti-Semitic sides throughout history, left or right. You've had people in the middle that don't harbor anti-Semitism necessarily, but also don't think about it in their everyday lives. And then you've had, for most of history, only Jews who've been aware of this evil because they've had to live with it. And I think you've also seen then, over the last few centuries in particular, an expanding awareness across Christian civilization and some others that anti-Semitism is evil and must be combated. And these three poles are kind of expanding and bumping up against each other. But the middle ground of people that are just apathetic about it, I think, is shrinking. And so the key point we have to work towards now is claiming more of the hearts and minds of that persuadable middle towards fighting anti-Semitism and towards understanding the justice and the rights, both for the state of Israel and for Jewish practice to continue and flourish across societies, and also continually refute the ideas that are coming from the anti-Semitic side. And briefly, just a little bit of quantification here before I turn it over to John. So the ADL, for years, the Anti-Defamation League, has tracked anti-Semitic acts across the globe, particularly across the US. And so just to give you some numbers for what it's looked like post-October 7th, there have been more than 5,200 anti-Semitic incidents just since October 7th. That's several 100% increase over the same period in past years that are tracked. Also, in 2023, there was a precipitous increase by dozens of percentage points even before October 7th. So we saw this rise in anti-Semitic acts even before we actually reached that crucial point. And I think you can really see that it was a fig leaf either way, that supposedly those people of goodwill would say there was maybe a day or 2 days or so where you could feel sorry for Israel after October 7th. They were victims, and sadly, that's something that a lot of the world can get behind for a brief period of time. The only good Jew is a dead Jew in some people's eyes. That's something you can cry over and you can mourn. But someone who's empowered and that can defend themselves, and that also then will get engaged in a conflict which necessarily has moral complexities, that's the type of Jew that is basically ripe for excoriation in many people's minds. And so there really was no actual honeymoon period. So this increase in anti-Semitism continued before the war, it increased after. And I think that's important to note that, again, whatever reason you hear from people when you're engaging with them, it's really a symptom of a deeper rot that you do have to confront ideologically, but it's also a spiritual thing to get behind more. And now, briefly, before John comes up, I'll give the bio for our two speakers. Following John's remarks, Simone and I will join him up here for a panel, and then we'll have your questions after. So first, my colleague Simone Rizkallah is the Deputy Director of Education at the Philos Project. As a first-generation American, Egyptian, Armenian descendant, Simone has a particular interest in matters of religious freedom, culture, and Eastern roots of the faith. Her graduate degree is in theological studies from Christendom College. Her undergraduate studies and professional background include marketing, communications, media, radio, and theater. She's also a frequent guest on Catholic Answers Live and a faculty member of the Avila Institute. Also, she's the co-host of our excellent Beyond Rome podcast, which was launched just a few weeks ago here out of the Philos Project. And now, Dr. Jonathan Silver is the Chief Programming Officer of Tikva, the editor of Mosaic, and the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow of Jewish Civilization. As the host of the Tikva podcast, he's hosted hundreds of writers, rabbis, education officials, military officials, artists, political figures, including members of Israel's Knesset, the U.S. Senate, and the Prime Minister of Israel. I highly recommend the Tikva podcast if you haven't listened to it. I've been a fan of it for years, and we're blessed to have John here in person. So over to you.
Okay, Isaac, thank you. Simone, Mark, thank you for having me. Thank you for joining me to do this. My friends, I'm happy to be here and I'm sad to be here. Sad because this is not a happy subject, but happy to be talking about it with you. I thought I'd just try to make 5 points over the next 10 minutes or so and establish what, in my view, anti-Semitism is and how to think about it. It's kind of a nebulous question. Is anti-Semitism a form of discrimination, a racial hatred, a spiritual disorder, a social phenomenon? Is it something ideological? It's hard to know. And I think that's the first thing to say about anti-Semitism is its mutability in history. In ages in which the heuristic for the dominant authority in the culture was religious, in theological ages, like in Christendom of the Middle Ages, then anti-Jewish sentiment took on a theological tone, and it was expressed in theological argument and through religious medium. And just to think about European history now, in later ages, when science replaced religion, at least for some people, as the dominant heuristic that established authority of truth and falsehood, then anti-Semitism acquired, or the hatred of Jews acquired, a different kind of expression. Then it was expressed in terms of pseudo-racial science, and it acquired that kind of vocabulary for its proponents to talk about. I think we live in a moment now in which the dominant authorities of the age refer not to science and not to religion, but to very big human rights ideologies and political ideas. And so it's not a surprise that moral authority, those being the moral authority that anti-Semitism expressed in that language. So now anti-Semitism is expressed by looking at Israel and calling it out for the sins that transgress that source of truth. Israel is said to be genocidal and guilty of racism and apartheid. And you can go down and look at every sin established in that kind of new source of authority and see. So it's not hard to understand why it's for that reason that it's hard to define. I want to propose a definition of what anti-Semitism is, and I think that it solves a problem for us. See, because the same phenomenon can exist in ages in which there are religious authorities and scientific authorities and political or ideological authorities, and therefore not any one of those discourses can fully explain what it is. I think that anti-Semitism is fundamentally at its root a political phenomenon, and it has to be understood in terms of politics. Anti-Semitism, very simply, is politics organized against the Jews. That's the definition that I want to advance tonight. I want to think about the problems that solves in a particular society. If anti-Semitism is politics organized against the Jews, well, think about the factious nature of the human condition. That all societies need some source of cohesion. And either it is because they're aiming at some positive good or they're trying to avoid some negative bad. And the Jews have very often in societies, in religious societies, in scientific societies or so-called scientific societies, in the ideological societies that we live in now, the Jews have very often served that purpose. It has been the external force against which politics can be organized. And that solves a lot of, or it seems to solve as a tactic, a lot of domestic political troubles. And I think that's the secret of its appeal to political and ideological leaders in various places. Think about the Soviet Union immiserated millions upon millions of people in the 20th century, and all of the domestic troubles it had. And so you can put yourself in the imagination to think about how useful it would have been, how useful, in fact, it was to have this other group on which all of those problems could be scapegoated and blamed. Think about the fractious nature of Arab societies. I think there's a fundamental, uneducated Western misunderstanding about the state of Arab politics in many Arab countries, as if the removal of this one Jewish state would solve all these problems. The fact of the matter is that it is precisely because Israel exists and is able to absorb so much of the frustration of Arab politics that those societies are able to avoid so many of the domestic and tribal political problems they have. That's why I want you to see anti-Semitism is explained best in this heuristic. Something which is, it has a spiritual valence and it has a religious valence, but I want to argue that it's fundamentally best understood most comprehensively by the political function it plays. And so when you're trying to assess some given anti-Semitic situation, think if you ask the great political question, cui bono, who benefits, you'll understand a lot about the function it's playing in a society. Why the Jews? Here in my definition of this, the Jews are not essentially involved in anti-Semitism. The Jews are merely the target which anti-Semites point their finger at. So why are they such an appealing target? My third point. Number one, I think there is a religious unassimilability that characterizes the Jews in history. In antiquity, many European philosophers and writers write about this. In antiquity, when a tribe was conquered, that tribe's gods were seen to be defeated. And therefore, the cult of those gods, having been defeated, would give way to a new pantheon. But the Jews refused to go along with that and clung to their Jewishness even when overtaken by, well, virtually every empire you can think of, the Babylonians and the Romans and the Seleucid Greeks, and on through history. I think that's true in the modern European experience, which is part of the reason why the Jewish question in Europe was straddled this political and religious line so delicately. The Jews would not assimilate and therefore were, in religious ages and according to the religious imagination, always a perennial other. There's a civic dimension to that too, a civic reason why the Jews are such a good target for anti-Semites to distract their populations from their own troubles. The civic reason, again, thinking through European history, it was not until the 18th century that Jews began to be given citizenship. And so they were residents that could be abused, that often played crucial civic functions, but were not full parts of a place. And therefore, their loyalty was questioned, and they were not seen as fully woven into the fabric of society. Now that has an effect. It means that they also did not have, though they were intensely political, trying to make themselves useful and find ways to integrate, nevertheless, they did not have the organized resources of power. And so, when anti-Semites harmed Jewish communities, they did not have the means to respond and could extract no political cost. So here you have a ubiquitous in virtually every country of Europe and a perennial other that will not be assimilated religiously, cannot be assimilated civically, and when you punch them, they cannot punch back. Okay, by the way, there's an analog to that story that could be told about the Arab world as well, but I think that's look, a book could be written about each of these points, but that is my snapshot analysis of why the Jews are such a valuable target for anti-Semites. Now, of course, when anti-Semitism occurs and the finger is pointed at the Jews, very often in the short term, it is the Jews who suffer. But in the long term, the anti-Semite suffers more than the Jews. This is a very important point that I want to make. It resonates with something that Isaac was saying before about how anti-Semitism can be seen as a kind of barometer of civic health. When a society wants to scapegoat its fundamental problems and not deal with them, and distract its population from their true sources, and misanalyzes, and instead points the problem over here, well, what would happen in that society? Those problems would linger. they would grow. The people who live there would grow more frustrated, hungrier, sicker, more broken. Those societies that deploy anti-Semitism as a political tactic suffer. I want to just think about the Palestinian society as a case study of this. Palestinian society has oodles of problems. It's horrible to be a Palestinian, and all of us should sympathize with what it means to wake up every morning as a Palestinian. Very hard to live in that society. Think about the squillions of dollars that have been given over to try to improve the lives and fate of Palestinian people. And what's happened to it? This is the most vivid example that I can think of because it's the most tactile for us now. Had that money been invested in the resources of civil society to build up Palestinian lives, had those resources been invested in actually creating the institutions of statehood, Palestinians would have been better. And instead, that money was invested, using this anti-Semitism as a tactic, it was invested to harm the Jews. And Israel's going to be fine, but it's the Palestinians who are going to suffer the most. Anti-Semitism harms the society in which it is incubating. My fifth point goes back to something else that Isaac said in the beginning. My last point, which is, yes, we've seen an exponential geometric rise in anti-Semitic activity since October 7th. That certainly forces some very profound questions for us American Jews. But I want you to notice the first thing that Isaac said, which is that anti-Semitism had been rising, exponentially rising, before October 7th. And we have to try to understand what that means for us as Americans and what that might signal about our culture and our society. Anti-Semitism is a kind of early warning sign for deeper cultural disorders. And when you can see it rising, it has the kind of effervescent bubbling up in various places. And when one sees that, I think that we have to look at the fundaments of our society and attend to our civic health. That means, to me, that the American fight against anti-Semitism is a fight for the American soul. At this hour, as we did 80 years ago on the beaches of Normandy, American Jews and Christians have got to stand shoulder to shoulder to redeem the American prospect. President Lincoln called Americans an almost chosen people. And we American Jews are a twice chosen people, chosen once by history and once by providence. And we have now to rise to meet this moment and try to redeem the American prospect. Thank you.
Simone. I'll be going the center. I'll move this out of the way. All right. Thank you so much, John. I'll bring in Simone briefly here, and then I have a lot more questions. We'll both be able to tag team here. Simone, I read a little bit in your bio about the many different identities you have as Armenian, also part of a diaspora across the Ottoman Empire. Really fascinating family history I've got to hear. And we've also had conversations about how that's informed your own perspective that led you to come to Philos and also more broadly arrive at philo-Semitism. So I wonder if you could share with the group a little bit about the family history and then some of those fascinating anecdotes you've shared about your ancestors even in Egypt and how some strains of this Christian tradition, even soaking amongst some of the most anti-Semitic cultures across the globe, managed to come out on the other side with someone like you.
Yeah, it's a really, really big question. I guess I'll start by saying that as an Armenian, anytime I would make friends with a Jewish person, we immediately felt like we were buddies, from our shared genocidal history and generational trauma. So that was always the first point. But I think more profoundly, I've been reflecting the origins of my philo-Semitism. Where did this come from? In this kind of unique way, especially being of Egyptian descent and, anti-Semitism being a thing, There's no PC way to say it. This is the American part coming out. And why my family was different. So I've been kind of wrestling with this because there's the intellectual assent of anti-Semitism as a reality, but then there's the existential bodily acceptance of it, which is a shock to my system. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Why? And, growing up, my dad, and I asked him this just a week or two ago. I said, Dad, you've always loved Jewish people. We used to tease him because, he has more Jewish books on his shelf than Christian ones. And I go, Dad, why? Where did this come from? Because it's not a typical Egyptian man, And, so we're on the phone and he goes, I just always liked them. I just always liked Jewish people. I go, yeah, but Dad, I want a scientific, but why? And it was, again, that affect of admiration, reverence, as Christians, our Messiah is Jewish. So again, it's not something that he parceled out into this reason, but that his heart was always there with it. And then later to find out that his best friend growing up was a Sephardic Jew that he didn't know about, till later. And then with my mother, her love of the Old Testament, her love of the prophets, her love, and her, again, you take your parents for granted, but just her frustration at Christians that didn't know the Old Testament, that didn't read their Bible, so that was one element of my analysis of my own philo-Semitism. And then my own conversion to the Catholic faith being through Christians that celebrated Shabbat, right? That they took the Sabbath seriously, that they sang songs in Hebrew, that they had a love for our Jewish brothers and sisters. So it wasn't just something on paper that the church says, hey, these are our elder brothers and sisters in the faith, but something that was a lived, embodied, incarnational reality. And then, and I was just telling my friend Josh back there, who's Jewish, that I kind of took for granted that I grew up with a lot of Jewish friends. And that also is, I think, something maybe rare for Christians. Maybe, again, these are things that I took for granted. I grew up in Los Angeles. I'd see Jewish people walking to synagogue on Friday. So again, this is part of my childhood nostalgia. And that, I think, being maybe perhaps rare. And then also as a Catholic Christian, that I grew up in kind of a parenthesis in church history where I'm post the Second Vatican Council, post the document Nostra Aetate, which talks about Jewish-Catholic relations. So I never heard, when you mentioned those theological underpinnings of, that anti-Semitism being a sad part of history in Christendom and European history. But for me, in my limited, small life, I never heard those theological, and which is a privilege, right? It's a rare moment in history. So I never heard that kind of theology. I never heard that kind of bias against Jewish people. So I thought that these four elements is kind of what I scaled it down to. And I thought, well, that's quite a privilege, having my parents, strange for, and I don't want to say, all Middle Eastern people are anti-Semitic, but, especially philo-Semitic, right? Being in this moment in post-Vatican II history, being evangelized by Hebraically formed Catholics, having a lot of Jewish friends growing up. I think all those pieces made it very difficult for me to encounter what we're encountering now with the percentage of 400% increase in anti-Semitism in 1 year. And this being a trend for the last 5 years that this is growing and growing and growing. And I'll just make one last thing. You know, I used to think that the trans movement was like the height of cultural decline, right? People who were mutilating their bodies. What could be more a manifestation of self-hatred and collective hatred, and the complicity of our culture in this movement where people are hurting their own bodies, the bodies that God gave them. And I thought, well, that's it. That's the height of it. Now it's really the end of it all. But then thinking about it more deeply, and now certainly post 10/7, it's not that. The real height of it is antisemitism. And because those are the people, the Jews, those are the ones who gave us this God whose image and likeness we're made after. And so there's an even more fundamental spiritual rot. And I thought that was the height of it. And then after the war, I thought, no, there's something deeper. And it's these people and hatred of them that is really what you were saying, Jonathan, we are all going to pay for it when you cut us off from the root. So I hope that answers your question, Isaac.
It does. Yeah. Reminds me too of an article written by our colleague Andrew Dorn, who you had on the podcast recently. So he wrote a piece in the European Conservative called Civilizations from the Jews, which I commend to the audience. And he traces that history. It's very interesting because you keep having this duality of there are like moral admonitions that civilizations, pagan or secular, rebel against, which come from the Jews. That's one reason to critique it, like you're making us feel bad for doing this thing. And then there's also, a bunch of other areas in which them just existing distinctively, as you were talking about, can be just a unifying force to target, whether they're powerful or poor in whatever society, and serving as that galvanizing force. But specifically on the aspect of the self-mutilation, it stood out to me how it's not something that I'd even thought about, but in the article, Andrew draws out how the prohibition against human sacrifice, and not even just sacrifice, but also more generally the desacralization of bloody mutilation, torture, sacrifice in different forms that came from the Jewish people was so rare in history. And then we kept seeing in later ages of colonial expansion and other times where we would encounter new pagan peoples or previously religious societies would become secular and then invent their own new ways of self-mutilation or worshiping sex or whatever it is. But it was a fascinating innovation that he brought out, that the demonstration of Abraham being brought up to sacrifice Isaac and then God preventing it to demonstrate this was how things were, it's not how it will be, and how that echoes through history. I think it's a gesture too of something that people still rebel against. In our modern societies, we don't have now literally people calling for human sacrifice, but we do in different ways. We have the cult of basically making the gratification of sexual urges and identity paramount. And if that's the goal, even if you aren't trans yourself or feel any of these ideas, someone else supporting, someone else feeling some kind of emotion and pursuing it, you don't want to shut that down, even if you think it's weird, because if you have your own desires or inclinations, you want that to be enabled by the society. So you can't judge because you don't want to be judged on your own particular things. And so it is still a form of human sacrifice we're doing, child sacrifice we're doing in a lot of these different ways, and something that I think the Jewish people continue to be a bulwark against. But I have a lot more questions, but I want to have a chance for you to react or add to anything.
I would just say, for those who are looking for additional horrors and additional reasons to put your head into your hands and weep, on this very score about human sacrifice. Okay, it's not human sacrifice, but you can understand that there is some kind of deep spiritual warrant for this horrible, monstrous assisted suicide regime that is now taking over in Canada, with the complicity, I have to say, of any number of synagogues and churches. And there's some connection between that and the way that we understand the dignity of human life, rooted in the image and likeness of God. So I think you do have to, and religious people have this talent of looking under the surface of policy and culture and seeing more fundamental drives that emerge from us. If we train our eyes in the Hebrew Bible and the moral teaching that it offers us, it helps us understand our society and the temptations around. I do think that's true.
Very well said. Another theme I wanted to bring out from your remarks, I wonder historically the reasoning behind this and to the extent you think it's cultural versus a particular type of religious heritage, but it seems to me that the Anglo-American tradition of philo-Semitism is particularly notable. So before the U.S. was created, after Cromwell came back in and readmitted the Jews, the UK at the time, I guess Great Britain would have been one of the most hospitable places for Jews at the time. Certainly as you get closer to the Victorian era, the first Jewish prime minister and Benjamin Disraeli in the 1800s, and then of course the U.S. also as a bastion for that. I'm wondering, what do you think are some of the causes of that, and does it teach us anything about better ways to fight these ideas, or the soil of a culture that you need to be maybe more resistant to anti-Semitism?
It's a very good question. I would say this summer you should get into your car and drive through the cities and towns and hamlets of New England, where you will drive through Canaan and Jericho and any number of places that show that the earliest American settlers from Europe were living in the biblical imagination, and they named their children Hebrew names, and they forced their students at Princeton to study Hebrew. Okay, and the emblem of Yale is in Hebrew. And there's something very deep from the colonial period of the United States onward that chimes. It is not Jewish, okay, because all of those people, of course, are Christian and think that what they're doing is recovering an aspect of Christianity. I well understand that. But you want to ask what warrants American philo-Semitism? It is because it is so deeply woven into the American DNA, which is why, Isaac, I really do think that the fight for recovering America and the fight against anti-Semitism are bound up together. And to me, I mean, I don't want to drive us all together into contemporary politics, but to me, you just can't help but observe that the people cheering on the Hamas butchers hate the United States. Yes. And the people who are waving Israeli flags are carrying in their other hand an American flag. And that is not one isolated incident. One sees that everywhere, and one understands it. Precisely because I think that these two experiences, these two civilizational patrimonies, are bound up together, and we see ourselves that way. And for me, as an American Jew, I really think that the Jews have something now to offer the United States. And that is trying to work with amazing people like Philos to try to save our country. And so I see it as completely bound up together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So several of you here have been at some of the rallies we've attended, and our fearless leader, Luke Moon, got these flags that he has bought for us, and we've taken across the country now, probably the globe. I'm sure they've done this elsewhere. But it's a kind of a fading flag of, I think it starts with the American and fades into the Israeli flag, or the other way around. And it's a cool symbol of that intertwining thing. And I was just thinking, I wonder if even they've manufactured the reverse of a Palestinian flag fading to America or otherwise. I would be highly surprised if they did. And that should be a question of like, well, why? Does that mean to the extent you're pro-Palestinian, you have to be kind of anti-American? And of course, many people probably wrestle with that and wouldn't want to own it. But there is a tension that you feel. I think if you were to ask, any of some of the most, I would say, pro-Hamas members of Congress, even in that, they feel that instinctive appeal. Even in mentioning America's goodness, they have to start with the denigration. And also, too, so...
on that, Isaac, let me just observe that there is a very important symmetry, I think, between the sort of critique that one sees about the United States and the sort of critique that I think, if you want to call it a critique, that one can discern in this kind of anti-Semitism. You see, there was an earlier form of American critique which said, America has ideals which are worth fighting for, but the American practice and American behavior and American law and American policy is falling short of those ideas. So it's our responsibility as patriotic American reformers to make America a little more like it's supposed to be, like itself. That's one form of, you could say, liberal American critique. I think that the effort to say, no, American ideals themselves are rotten, and American ideals themselves do not have a basis in goodness. They are evil. And there's talk about, there's a distorting, distracting talk about noble ideas, but we all know that those are really there to mask the true power interests of the slavers that founded that kind of thinking, okay? That kind of thinking is similar to the kind of thinking that says, it's not that I don't like Israel's prime minister, and it's not like I don't like this member of the governing coalition. It's not that I wish Israel would do this instead of that. It's to be distinguished from the attitude which I think one does see in the Hamas protesters, which says Israel itself is a blot on the world, and we have to remove it from history. The Jews, the Jewish people, and their country has got to be unborn. Okay, that is a different sort of mentality, and I just want to observe the symmetry between these two kinds of critique, because I think that one sees over there not a tactical, but a fundamental critique of America that lives alongside a fundamental critique of Israel. And over here, I think one can say, look, I like Bibi, I don't like Bibi. Okay, that's legitimate. Right? Some people like him, some people don't like him. I wish that they would prioritize this, I wish they would prioritize that. Okay, that's legitimate. Okay. But the fundamental critique that says Israel has got to be disappeared. Okay, that we can see a symmetry between that and the 1619 Project and spirits.
Yeah. So I was just thinking that it seems analogous to, so, everyone has family issues to different extents. Nobody's family is perfect. But you could think of it almost like the charter of the U.S. or the Constitution or the founding of Israel, or even the covenant Abraham made with God. The ideals of all of those things didn't presuppose perpetual virtuous action because you're working with flawed individuals. So it's almost, I think a lot of these critiques that come against Israel and also the West now are of a different flavor here. So imagine you had family drama and you need a counselor, or you have an in-law or adopted person coming into the family, and there's this document written years ago by a flawed family to say, in this family we love each other, we want to do what's right, we want to stick up for each other, all of those things. And there's probably thousands of examples over the course of that family that you could go in and say, you didn't hear, or Uncle Joe is a drunk, or Aunt Kathy cheated on her taxes, or you did this, you didn't tell me about that. All of those recriminations could go on perpetually. But if someone tries to enter a family and fix issues, starting with those critiques to say, hey, you guys said this in this document, but I see all these other flaws. This is just a load of crap, like you all suck. So it's treating the spirit and the ideals that the family aspires to, or in this case, the nation, as just completely hypocrisy because of any failure to completely cohere. But all of us know just psychologically, no family is going to respond well to improvement by that. And that's what it seems like when we hear the critiques against the West and against Israel and the US, that if you fundamentally get at the sense that the person critiquing you hates you, or your people, or your culture, or the history, whatever other ways they want to reform things seem to be very marginal, and the merits of them can be lost by most people. And I think that's somewhat of the strength we have against some of the more radical forces, because the average not ideological American can feel that spirit. Even if they're like, yeah, slavery was bad and that's kind of a problem we need to reform, I agree with all of that. But if you get a hateful spirit that repudiates the basic identity, I think that's going to turn off most people from further improvement. Yeah, Simone, I want to give you a chance to jump into anything that stands out. I'm curious too, I know you've told me some interesting stories of dispatches from the Catholic community and encountering this issue, and I know there's a lot of complexity. Something stood out in the news the other day. I don't think it was officially sanctioned, maybe it was a rogue MP who did this, but they put the Palestinian flag on the Cathedral of Milan, and it was briefly up there. Yeah, I don't know if it was officially sanctioned, maybe other people know.
Oh my. Goodness.
So a few things on that. I'm curious about dispatches from the Catholic side as a Protestant, but also too, we could talk more on this theme of anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, because I'm sure any church official that approved that, if it was, or was sympathetic, if you were to go up to them and say, well, you have the Palestinian flag, Palestinians support Hamas, Hamas is genocidal against Jews, isn't this anti-Semitic? They would say, oh, no, of course not. We're not anti-Semitic. We're Christians. We love everyone. We love the Jews. But this anti-Zionism thing can be seen as separate, its own kind of cause.
Well, I can tell a very blunt, candid story, as Egyptians do. I recently, because again, I'm picking everybody's brains in the Catholic world, not in the Catholic world, and I had a conversation with someone who was just speaking, again, with so much affect and so much love for Jewish people. And I thought, okay, great, okay. So then I wanted to analyze why. Well, I read the scriptures, like, okay, great. And then I bring up what's going on. And then the spirit shifted to, no, not the Zionist. I said, well, okay. I don't like the word feminist. I used to work in women's apostolate work, okay? But am I pro-woman? Yes. But I don't like the word. Look, you don't have to like the word Zionist. Are you pro-Jewish? Okay, yes. And a very practical question. I said, where do you want Jews to go? Where do you want them to go? And then he stopped and said, that's a good point. Think about it. I said, yeah, why don't you think about it? Because when my dad's best friend's sisters could no longer sustain life in Cairo, Israel was the only place they could go. Do you not want them to have their safe space? Because it seems like perhaps as Christians, at the very least, right? I want philo-Semitism for all Christians and for all people, but let's just start with Christians first, okay? But at the very least, maybe you don't have to have my dad's heart, but practically speaking, for all the talk of safe spaces, what do you want? And also the point about reality, right? I think Chesterton said, you can't critique what you don't love, but also in reality, like you said, Jonathan, Israel's not going to go away. So in reality, what is your solution? Because you can feel so pious and so, oh my gosh, this conflict and da-da-da-da. Okay, but in reality, what do you want to see? And who do you want to win? Yes, there's complexities. Yes, there's critiques. Yes, there's all of that. But also, there's also a simple interpretation, too, that I think we can be brave about.
Yeah, that's well said. Could you touch a little bit on the anti-Zionism as a cover for anti-Semitism, or how those two fade into each other?
Yeah, I find this a very common question, but it's a question I honestly I don't really like, and I don't get it. I don't think there's a difference. I think that in the modality that we have now, the easy to describe problem with the Jews is their country. But you know what? If there was another thing, it would be another thing. So I think that it's like, when you see it, okay? Every synagogue on every Shabbat in every city across this country, trust me, there are Jews complaining about Israel, okay? And its government and
Exactly.
like, have you people ever been to Israel? You know how Israelis feel about Israel? Like, let me tell you something. Criticism of Israel is totally not the issue, okay? But yes, the essential demands that the Israeli government does not have a solemn responsibility to defend its own citizens is a kind of insanity that is not rooted in planet Earth. That is what governments are here to do. Okay, so the whole anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism thing. But I do want to say something about the flag in Milan. I don't know if I didn't hear that, so it's not about that in particular, but I do want to say, I'm going to imagine a hypothetical place which, for the very best of their own motives, their most charitable motives, the most philanthropic motives, says, I see human suffering, and I want to stand in solidarity with that human suffering. Okay, so I want to try to myself charitably think my way into that perspective. And to that person, I have something very serious to say. It is not easy to say, but I think it's got to be said. In this conflict, Hamas has debuted a new strategy in the history of warfare, which we have to understand if we're going to understand how the conflict is going to end. The new strategy which Hamas has debuted is that they are not only trying to harm civilians on the other side, but a key to their success is harming the civilians on their side. And therefore, every minute that one delays the end of this conflict, you are producing more Palestinian suffering. And if you care about the Palestinians, as a decent person ought to care about the Palestinians, you need Israel to win in Rafah and end the regime of Hamas there. I think that is just a very simple, hard truth that has got to be said even to people who are moved by the most wonderful love in their heart.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, to me, that's how I see it.
Yeah, it's very concrete. I've used this analogy too in talking to people of like the worst form of gang warfare and gang-ruled neighborhoods, close to us in DC, even some communities facing horrible hardships in that way. And if you were to see, and I know some of these people go to the same grocery store as some people at my church, and if you were to go to them and anybody who's actually living that and propose, okay, there's clashes between police and different gangs, and I see violence, I don't like violence, and like a stray bullet hit a child the other day, and that's tragic. So we should minimize the amount of shooting, which even this is like a problematic analogy because Hamas and these inherently like gang-like groups will fight each other, and that's where most of the carnage would come from. But if you were to just propose, let's have one side lay down their arms, the police in this case, or Israel in that case, and just let things go, does anyone believe for a second that's actually a better, more flourishing way for that neighborhood, that community, that country to operate, to live under mob, horrific tactics like we've seen? And just to put a finer point too on what you're saying about the strategy too, it is very unique because the whole military operation of October 7th presupposed our immediate environment. That was their goal. This is why they went in with a small force, no tiny vanishing shot at actually overthrowing the military of Israel. They didn't target military targets, they targeted civilians. They documented in excruciating detail the atrocities they committed, both for their own propagandistic support back home and then to publicize, knowing it would inflame Israel, like any rational state, to have to respond and fight back, knowing that the superior military power of Israel would end up inflicting more casualties as a result of how they use human shields. So the whole thing presupposed we have to create a provocation, flash it to the world. We know we can't beat you, but we're going to highlight your response as the justification to continue us ongoing. And then if you look back in history, this keeps repeating itself. And in the face of that kind of evil, even if you don't care anything about Israel or the Jewish people, the actual plight of Palestinians, what they live under, what the regime is like, if you care about their own best interests, you would support any power that's trying to uproot them from that.
Yeah. So I want to just to return to the theme, to emphasize just how valuable for Hamas as a governing body, fomenting, encouraging anti-Israel attitudes has been for them as to keep the peace in Gaza itself. And that's another case study that one can think through to try to see how it functions. And that's why I think it can be best understood in this political rubric.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe we'll turn a little to some of the possible solutions. It's obviously an age-old evil that's never fully defeated, but I think there's ways in which the work we do at Philos and the work that you do at Tikva are kind of on the forefront of some of these things. So I'd love for you to talk some about the Jewish education you guys offer, and specifically, I think, some really positive moves we've seen where a lot of American Jewish influence and money and resources and thought, which was just kind of preemptively invested in these major American institutions that we're seeing now are either pro-Hamas or utterly feckless in the face of pro-Hamas protesters. What maybe encouraging things have you seen of people waking up to, reprioritizing the institutions that they support?
Okay, this is a very good question, very intricate question. If you just focus on the story of American campuses and higher education, it's not true in every case, okay, but by and large and for the most part, the more like mainstream prestigious an institution is, like the worse it's been. Okay, again, like not in every case, okay, obviously, thank God, but in too many cases. So where does one see hope? And I think that there are pockets of the Jewish community that are starting to see this. One sees hope by looking more deeply into the heartland of America. And I think that one sees in a variety of red states some, first of all, policy experimentation that has to do with investing in higher education that is not ideological and that aims to recapture the spirit and purpose of the liberal arts and great books. By the way, a spirit and purpose which admits a huge amount of the freedom of thought and expression, but which nevertheless stands for something which is rooted in the West and sees its mission to, in part, defend the West. I think one sees that in a variety of exciting campus experiments. Certainly one sees that at places like the University of Austin. One sees it, if you're paying attention to what is happening at the University of Florida. Of course, there are places that have been doing this kind of thing for a long time at Hillsdale. I think that there are any number of, places to which American Jews have now got to transfer the prestige that was once reposed in the Princetons and Yales and Harvards and Stanfords of the world. And those are actually very great places. And in many cases, they're places that would love to welcome Jewish students. And so part of our work at Tikva is trying to dimension a Jewish exodus from those prestige places and helping Jewish students find their way to not only more welcoming places. It's not primarily a safety issue. It's primarily what a pity that you wasted your 4 years on a boring, uninspiring education that taught you to hate everything your parents cherish. Okay, so I think that there's pull factors and push factors, but our main priority at Tikva in the higher ed space over the next many years, I think, is to try to steer students towards places that are healthier for Jewish life, and that can inspire the Jewish soul and Jewish mind to stand shoulder to shoulder with Christians and invest in America.
Yeah, I think that's very encouraging. We've seen.
Why don't we cut to questions so we have time for other voices?
Yep. Yeah, we'll just wrap up on this point. A lot of the work we've done at Philos too has been trying to pull people, not just from those institutions, but from across a lot of Christian education, to be able to go and counter these ideas and make relationships with Jews for the first time. And we've seen a lot of flourishing across that, and I think we'll continue to see this now where people's past prioritizations of the prestige of certain institutions is getting modulated by, what are the results of the people actually coming out of it? Are they actually happy? Are they actually gaining something from the education? And I think that the free resources that we offer and that you offer at Tikva will be a continuing way people can go through to go deeper into that. So would love to hear any questions or comments you guys have so far. So just raise your hand, I'll call on you. Just give us your name and then go for it. Oh yeah, come up here to the mic actually.
Hi, I'm Jeff Stansland. I had a provocative question. I'll set it up this way. I don't think we would usually say, or hopefully we wouldn't say, oh, that's the Ashkenazi American perspective. Or, oh, that's the Christian male American perspective. But should we use the phrase, the Jewish culture, or should we say a Jewish culture? The idea is, are we so obsessed with identities, and are we shrinking what we think of as an identity? And there is a very risk that we're shrinking it to the wrong thing. I'm thinking if we can only think of people narrowly in a certain identity. When I grew up, when you were thinking, oh, well, maybe, okay, you're going to talk about Jewish people and race, what comes into your mind? And kind of Shermer being lynched as he's going down to be a freedom rider and register black folks. That's kind of the image from the history books. If you have a new image and it's a settler stopping a food truck going into Gaza, it seems like we need to have some sort of idea that where you can say it's a broad enough image where both of these images can stick in your mind at the same time. If that makes sense. But the overarching question is, should we stop using the phrase the Jewish culture and say a Jewish culture?
Okay, so I think that the Jewish experience in the United States, I can try to explain by reference to the way that Abraham felt. Abraham was both a stranger and neighbor. And that is the way that Jewish Americans do and ought to feel. Christian Americans are our neighbors. And we share the same responsibilities and draw the same benefits from the public square as any other American does. But we don't want to be fully assimilated into American culture to the extent that it robs us of our covenantal responsibility to our own tradition and who we are. And to me, the secret sauce of American exceptionalism is that it doesn't demand that of us. It doesn't really demand that Simone stop being herself, or that I stop being myself. And in some ways, I think that for Jewish Americans to invest in more particularistic Jewish education for their children is an expression of what America empowers, enables. So I think that we have to understand the both and nature of American life here, that we're both strangers and neighbors. And to me, the person who embodies that maybe best, whom we just lost, was Senator Lieberman. You know, a Democratic senator who, obviously in the year 2000, was the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, never compromised 1 second, a minute, any part of his Jewish devotion, and yet felt called to serve the American public square as any other public servant would, and was able to model the way that those two things live together. So if one is looking for an image of what America makes possible, and the sort of America that Jews are going to be comfortable in, when an Orthodox Jew can have that kind of prominence in the society, and nevertheless see himself as serving that society, I think that he's an example of what you could look at.
Thank you. Next question.
Hey, thank you so much for hosting this talk tonight, and really interesting points. Even as a Jewish American, lots of really interesting points that I hadn't even thought about, both in the speeches and in this panel discussion. My question is, and there was a brief discussion about higher education. I think my biggest fear, there are so many anti-Semitism fires that need to be put out right now. But I think also my biggest fear is that, are we going to be facing a tsunami in, 20, 30 years when you see the current kids who are on college campuses who are either involved in some of these anti-Israel, anti-Semitic protests, and the students who are just walking among them, maybe not even part of this protest, but who are going to be normalized and thinking, oh, that anti-Semitic comment, that's normal, that's acceptable. And I really wonder, and what I'd want to hear you guys talk about is, do you think there needs to be a special strategy for college campuses for the students who are maybe not in either camp, but just being in that and living in that environment? Thank you.
Should I say something? Well, I mean, I'll just speak in my little Catholic world. I've been in the Catholic world for the past 20 years, and I've given talk after talk about we're living, reductions of the gospel, right? My friend Father Matt is here, and we talk about this all the time, that Christianity has been reduced to moralism, a set of ethics, an intellectual system. A lot of American Catholics fall into this political spirit, right? And that's not the heart of the gospel. Or they're sentimental about it. I'm Irish Catholic, so it's identity, right? I mean, but the actual gospel is this encounter. It's this encounter with the person of Jesus, and that is what informs all of life. And I think that for me, and this is what I hope to do through the work at Philos Catholic, is to, in some way, so this is work that I've been doing for 20 years, but here in this Philos context, is that a way to salvage what we would say is authentic Christian expression and faith is to return to our Hebraic roots, right? And that will save what we consider to be authentic Christian expression. That is very idealistic, Josh, but I think that will be a huge, huge way to say, wait a minute, like the deepest, most profound understanding and living of my faith is Hebraic, because I'm claiming that my Messiah is Hebraic and is Jewish. It's a Jewish man, and a priest friend of mine said to me recently that he has no appetite, no taste, and no tolerance for anti-Semitism because his Messiah is Jewish and his queen is Jewish, right? The Virgin Mary in our faith is a Jewish woman. And so there's no room for it whatsoever. So there's no longer, I feel, in the Catholic world, any kind of like, I don't care about this issue, or this doesn't really affect me, or it's really not that big a deal. It's so urgent and so crucial to what I would say is, a dying church. For every one convert to Catholicism, we lose 7. And that's because it's not, in my Catholic opinion, because it's not being evangelized well. Well, why isn't it being evangelized well? Because it's being lived out in a reductionistic way, but why? And I would say the heart of that is because we are not connected to our Jewish roots. And I think what I love so much about Bishop Barron, great evangelizer, Father Mike Schmitz, right, all these big names in the Catholic American world, is that they're switched on to this problem, and they're also trying to build a Hebraic culture. So when Bishop Barron talks to Ben Shapiro about re-Judaizing Catholicism, or Father Mike Schmitz says we're not even a separate people, for Christians to meet a fellow Jew and to say, like, I belong to you in some mysterious way, even if you don't want me to belong to you, right? that I have a reverence for you and a love for you, even if you have a rightful mistrust of me. And I remember my dad saying when he moved to Santa Monica from Cairo, Egypt, that, he went to UCLA and he found all the Jewish kids and he became friends with them. And he's like, I knew they didn't quite trust me. I didn't blame them, but eventually they did, and that they were my friends, right? To have that, to build that sort of Christian, that sort of person, I think can be extremely powerful. I'm not a Catholic today because I'm in the Catholic school, because of my Catholic parish, because of my priest. I am because I met ordinary Catholic men and women who celebrated Shabbat. We didn't even talk theology. We didn't talk about anti-Semitism. We didn't really talk about Jewish people, but we celebrated the Lord's Day and took it seriously. And when I see all these young people on college campuses, and they're doing what they're made to do, which is religious things, right? To sacrifice, to care for the less fortunate, right? It's just expressed in a disordered way, in a disordered cause. But their hearts, which are made for these great things, are finally being engaged. And when you have an epidemic of loneliness going on, and then you give them a cause to get behind, it is very, very powerful. Well, no wonder they're going to all gravitate towards it. Well, the church has to be more powerful, more strong, propose a communal life together that's more attractive than that narrative. We have the greatest story in the world. Let's propose it and live it and embody it. That's more attractive than the counter proposal. So I hope that's okay.
I agree with that. Actually, I do agree with that. I think that America is better when Christians are more Christian, and when Catholics are more Catholic, and I think that more flourishing religious life in the country will be better for the country and for its Jewish citizens. I do think that. Yeah. Josh, I guess in my view, the reason why I was trying to carefully emphasize that anti-Semitism takes the Jews as a target, but the anti-Semites are the problem. And Jews cannot fix their accusers.
So true.
This is a problem that America has got to deal with. That's why I'm trying to frame this. The Jews are a symbol that illuminates something about the disorder of the country. And so when I look on campuses, I see the Jews as playing we are a siren flashing for the rest of the United States to look and say, like, there's a very profound disorder here. And maybe working together, Jews and Christians can offer Hebraic remedies to that disorder. But Jews by themselves can't do it. At Tikva, our effort to try to serve Jewish students, I think probably takes two main forms. One, there are always going to be dissidents on campus who are in an unsafe environment, a bad environment, but they got into their dream school and they're there, or maybe, I don't know, they're juniors next year. What, they're going to transfer now? Like, that's not realistic, okay? So for those people, we have to strengthen them and give them the moral courage to walk around without feeling ashamed of who they are, and trying to arm them with the ideas that's our purpose. We're not a political organization, we're an ideas organization. We want to arm them with the moral and intellectual confidence to live out as Jews, wherever they are. But you can't look at the campus situation now and pretend that it's like that you'd entrust your daughter to those lunatics there. So where were they going to go? And that's where we're trying to work with other institutions to try to make places that are better. And by the way, they're going to be better for Christians also. But I think that's a dual movement. One, strengthening the dissidents on campus, and two, engineering an exodus out of Egypt toward a different kind of promised land.
Well said. Maybe time for one more, and then we'll also be around for some questions after. Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Kelsey. You know most of you. So I just got to go to the year anniversary of the Abrahamic Family House in Abu Dhabi in February. It was an awesome experience. People don't know what that is. It's in Abu Dhabi, a mosque, a synagogue, and a church all in one central location together, with the education center in between all of them, where people of different faiths can share amongst each other. It was awesome. I saw some of my Emirati friends opening up Arabic translations of the Torah and reading it. It was like a really cool experience. I think a lot of the foundations of anti-Semitism come from a fundamental lack of understanding, lack of discourse, and lack of exposure. I think you brought up some great points with your background, how you were exposed to Judaism, from your childhood onward, and really inspired you and affected you in a lot of positive ways. But I think we're not exposed to people of different cultures and have the opportunity to have those conversations. That's where hate comes from, is a lot of misunderstanding. So what do you think we can do, both institutionally, through the church, through government, through the private sector, but also personally, to try to help bridge some of those gaps, create more exposure, and create more understanding for people like the Abrahamic Family House does?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's simple. I won't talk too long. Just like becoming friends with each other is a big deal. I think that's where we got the word Philos, friendship. It goes a long way. And I think when Jonathan, you were talking about, you have to loving your country. Criticism is merited when it's rooted in love, right? You can love Israel, you can love America, you can critique, but there's a fundamental agreement about the goodness of something by which then you can critique. And I think that growing up in my high school experience, for example, all of my close friends, it wasn't about, they weren't Catholic. Maybe one was Catholic, but the rest were Muslims and Hindus. But why? Because there was this we're the child of immigrants. We love this country. We're grateful for it. Also, we care about doing homework, and so there was that shared experience. Jews, Muslims, Hindus, right? And my one Catholic Lebanese friend, right? But we had very similar values, but also a love and a gratitude for this country. So I think you made a great point. We can't fix people that are starting from the wrong, that, but we can build bridges when we can. I think friendship, it seems like a weak response, but I actually do think it does work for those who want it to work and for those who are open to it, which, you can't. That's the best we can do.
Just to underscore what Simone said, I would make a recommendation for building the kinds of friendships that are likely to bear fruit. And that is that religious Christians should seek out religious Jews. And you'll find that you have more in common. And it's been my experience very often that I find I have more in common with religious Christian friends than on some very fundamental matters with secular Jews. And so, well, yeah, one has to know where to look. But that'd be my advice.
Yeah. I'll just conclude by answering that as well. I think so much of it is stuff we do at Philos, which Kelsey knows as an alumni. We did a trip to the UAE a few years back and had a similar awesome experience. I think it's two parts. It's the relational things. That's really the most powerful, I think, is those personal connections. But then when we take people through our programs, or if you go through our education, equipping you to understand the origins of this evil, as we've talked about, and then also some basic level arguments against the anti-Zionism side, because that is the cover that a lot of people use now to justify it. I think of some debates I've had with friends back home in Georgia, where growing up basically had no Jewish people around, and I know these people in their heart, they don't have any anti-Semitism deeply rooted, but skeptical of Israel, and have those questions. So equipping people to refute those kind of ideas that I think left unanswered can metastasize into, well, Israel's corrupt and the US is supporting it because of a Jewish lobby, and it's all about civilizational rot and kind of wrapping things up. That's maybe what some kind of right-of-center Christians can lapse into. So refuting the arguments about Israel can cut off some of that. But I think, too, then it's about being ambassadors. I think having those friendships be shown to the world on the woke side, to be actual examples of interfaith dialogue, close friendships, relationships that are centered towards aiming at a common goal. That's why, as John was saying, the deeply religious find that kind of allegiance. And as Christians, I'll find that too, a closer bind as a Protestant to a committed Catholic than I will to maybe some denominations I won't mention that I think take things a little less seriously. And it's a cultural practice. So aiming towards that goal, united in friendship, intellectual equipment to refute these ideas, and hopefully, people along the path seeing us walking, they'll have the choice. They can choose death or choose life, to use the biblical example, and hopefully they choose what's good about the relationships they see and the civilization we're trying to create. So with that, thank you so much, John, for joining us. Simone, thank you for your remarks, and thank you all for coming. Have a good night.